The story of the Van Cortlandt House, the land it sits on, and its historical occupants could fill volumes. This video will only provide an overview of the site's history, but please direct any questions to the museum staff for more information. When Frederick Van Cortlandt had this house built in 1748, this area was part of Yonkers. Frederick Van Cortlandt's father, Jacobus, a wealthy merchant, first purchased land in this area in 1693, and over the years the Van Cortlandts continued purchasing lots from local farmers until they amassed a large estate. In 1701, Jacobus Van Cortlandt paid local Lenape people to secure legal ownership of the land, which the Van Cortlandts referred to as their plantation. 3 generations of the Van Cortlandt family held enslaved Africans on the property to work as servants, but also to perform various forms of skilled labor and farm work. At various times, the majority of people living on the property were, in fact, of African descent. The West Parlor speaks to the Dutch roots of the Van Cortlandt family, as well as to how their plantation fits into the global economy of the colonial period. Note the blue and orange colors of the north wall. These are the original paint colors as determined by microscopic paint chip analysis. They are an homage to the first Dutch flag, which is echoed by the colors of the New York City flag as well as various New York sports teams. The Dutch Republic was a major seafaring commercial power that experienced a cultural golden age at the time that the first Van Cortlandts arrived in New York, which was then a Dutch colony called New Netherland. That golden age was fueled by the wealth acquired by Dutch merchants who traded in commodities and goods from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. The Van Cortlandts amassed their wealth by continuing in this tradition. On this plantation, they produced the flour and butter that was demanded in the southern colonies and Caribbean. And in southern ports, their ships were loaded with commodities produced in warmer climates such as sugar, lime, and indigo, which were sold in northern markets. The profits from these trades were great, in large part due to the exploited labor of enslaved Africans who were producing those commodities both here and on southern plantations. The ornately carved overmantel is one indication that the East Parlor was where the Van Cortlandts may have entertained their most esteemed guests. As part of New York's wealthy elite, the Van Cortlandt social circle included members of other aristocratic families. The Schuylers, Phillipses, Jays, Astors, all married into the Van Cortlandt family while they lived in this house. High society guests would have appreciated the craftsmanship evident in objects like the 5-legged gaming table, which was gifted to the museum from Van Cortlandt descendants. The unusual addition of the 5th leg indicates that the table was likely made in New York. While not original to the house, an imported instrument like the 1771 Baker Harris spinet could have been used to entertain guests as they danced into the late hours. It was made in London, but constructed from globally sourced materials, such as mahogany from Central America, as well as ebony and ivory from Africa for the keyboard. The intricate detail in the mantel suggests that it was carved in the 1760s, decades after the house was built, when the lavish Rococo style reached its peak in America. It was most likely carved by London-trained artisans who traveled the colonies to work for wealthy patrons. The Van Cortlandts, like other New Yorkers, were eager to keep up with European trends. The mantel is an example of how the Van Cortlandts updated their homes in keeping with the latest style. Painstakingly restored, the dining room has been brought back to how it appeared during the ownership of August Van Cortlandt, who lived here after the American Revolution until 1823. The room is an excellent representation of the elegant style of the Federal period. As the room underwent restoration, various wallpapers were discovered under layers of paint and plaster dating from 1750. The wallpaper that adorns the room today is a reproduction of one of those layers found in the room dating back to about 1820. It was originally manufactured in France. The table is set with Van Cortlandt family china, which was passed down through the generations and gifted to the museum by Charlotte Van Cortlandt. Each colorful porcelain plate depicts a central scene of a boy presenting a bird to a lady seated under a pine tree. Meals were prepared by enslaved or free servants. Like some other houses from this period, the kitchen was located in a separate structure outside the house. This is believed to have reduced the risk of fire. The Dutch chamber on the second floor is unique among the room exhibits here, as it was not intended to depict how this room of Van Cortlandt House was used historically. Rather, it was meant to portray how a one-room home on Lower Manhattan may have looked during the Dutch colonial period when Lower Manhattan was still known as New Amsterdam. The objects in the room suggest ownership by a middle-class family, such as that of Anne Lockermans and Olaf Stevensy van Cortlandt. Olaf came to America in 1637 to work and live in the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. To your left is an example of a slaapbank, like the one that Olaf van Cortlandt purchased for his New Amsterdam house. It served as a bed for visitors, with doors that could be closed during the day but were thrown open only at night. It is thought to be the predecessor to the fold-away bed. On the east wall is a large painted cabinet known in Dutch as a kast. These were used to store linens and valuable textiles. This example, built around 1700, is one of only 6 known painted casts, all of which were built for New York Dutch families. Enclosed in the display case on the second-floor landing is probably one of the oldest known American dollhouses. While the house is labeled with 1774 and 1744, it is unknown what the dates signify. It is open on both sides, allowing a child to play on either side, and features storage in the attic and the bottom drawer. It would pass down from a family in Boston, Massachusetts, and has been on display in the museum since 1910. Not long after the Van Cortlandt house became a museum, this bedroom was dubbed the Washington bedroom. It was thought to be the room George Washington was most likely to have slept in when he stayed at Van Cortlandt House on October 12, 1776, and again on November 20, 1783, just before the triumphant march to reclaim New York City from the British at the end of the Revolutionary War. The end of hostilities marked the final chapter in a difficult period for Van Cortlandt House and its inhabitants. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the area around Van Cortlandt House came into focus as it was home to the strategically important Kingsbridge and Free Bridge, the only 2 bridges to Manhattan. James Van Cortlandt, who owned this house at the time, was ordered by New York's Provincial Congress to determine where it would make sense to erect fortifications in the area. After the British took control of Manhattan in 1776, Van Cortlandt House was often situated between the front lines of the British Army to the south and the Patriot forces to the north. Throughout the war, today's Bronx was the scene of many skirmishes, raids, and foraging expeditions that preyed upon the farms of local inhabitants. Some of the objects in this bedchamber may lead you to wonder what life was like for a woman living in Van Cortlandt House. Much of the answer to that question depends on the class and race of the woman in question. For middle and lower class white women who lived in neighboring houses, the days would be spent washing, ironing, baking, sewing, spinning thread, and weaving. Plus, there was seasonal work, such as gardening, hiving bees, making cider, and making soap and candles. The Van Cortlandt women, having both enslaved and free house servants, would have supervised this work as opposed to doing it themselves, with the exception of needlework, which is an activity frequently performed by upper-class women. The experience of growing up a child in the Van Cortlandt family could not be considered typical, as the family's wealth set them apart from the average New York colonist. Families in the colonial period did not typically see their newborn children as individuals, often referring to them not by sex or by name, but rather as it. Even months after babies were christened, they were commonly called the baby or the child. However, as the children got older, stronger bonds were formed. Enslaved servants often looked after toddlers and older children because rich white mothers often bore children in close succession and needed to tend to their youngest. Architectural evidence suggests that enslaved people working as servants to the Van Cortlandts occupied this part of the house. Enslaved servants frequently were housed in unheated rooms such as these in the 18th and 19th centuries. The doorway leading to the back staircase is further indication that enslaved servants would have slept here, as it would have allowed them to move about the house out of sight. Enslaved Africans were first recorded here in a 1698 census, which names 4 enslaved people living in the area. When Frederick Van Cortlandt wrote his will in 1749, he named 9 enslaved people whom he bequeathed to his children. The death of the enslaver would probably have been a painful episode for those he enslaved, as they were separated from their families and distributed to various Van Cortlandt relatives living in different places. Some enslaved people on the plantation lived in the Van Cortlandt house, while others resided in outbuildings. For example, Piero, the enslaved miller, most likely lived at the nearby mill with his wife Hester and son Peter. The mill was located at the southern end of the mill pond, a body of water that still exists in Van Cortlandt Park. The pond itself was probably created by enslaved people who dammed Tibbetts Brook to make the pond that powered the mill. Other features of the park, such as certain trails and Van Cortlandt House itself, were built with slave labor. Evidence suggests that locally enslaved people were interred in a burial ground near the mill pond. Enslaved house servants, such as Dinah, resided here in the main house. In 1821, Augustus Van Cortlandt legally freed Dinah in his will in consideration of the great care and attention she paid to my deceased affectionate wife during her last illness. This room, known as the unfinished chamber, is used for temporary exhibits. Currently, you can see the Tibbetts Tapestry exhibit, along with quilts that were made by local volunteers in 1976. The room is a good place to view the wooden pegs that hold the rafters together, along with the broad axe marks on the hand-hewn beams. The view to the south from Van Cortlandt House would have been quite different in the colonial period than today. A visitor to the house in 1778 wrote that directly in front of the house was a fine garden laid out in a variety of figures adorned with flowers. In the low-lying area past the iron gates that you see today, Tibbetts Brook flowed south toward the Spite and Dival Creek. The low-lying area was a marshland fed by the waters of Tibbetts Brook and, at high tide, salt water from the Spite and Dival Creek. Early colonists in the area referred to that area as the meadow, and it was desirable as grazing land for cattle. But the salt water and soft, wet soil could not have supported large trees, which resulted in an unobstructed view toward the Harlem River and the hills of northern Manhattan. During the American Revolution, straight ahead, you would have seen the imposing presence of Fort Independence sitting on the slope of Kingsbridge Heights. The guns of the fort overlooked the Albany Post Road, which approached the Van Cortlandt property from the south, then crossed from east to west in the marshy area directly in front of the house. By design, any traveler on this important roadway would have seen the impressive sight of the front of Van Cortlandt House towering over the valley to the south.